So for today's video, as you can tell by the title, I'm gonna be talking about moving in with a partner. Max and I have lived together now for about 4 years, I think. I'm sure when he watches this, he will correct my math if it's incorrect. But I think it's been about 4 years. And this was kind of inspired by the fact that a lot of my friends either just moved in with partners or are about to move in with partners. But before we get into it, I should reintroduce myself. My name's Mackenzie. This is my channel Think Too Much. In today's video, we are going to be talking about what you should expect when you move in with a partner and how to kind of get through some of the obstacles that inevitably arise when moving in with someone you're in a relationship with. Okay, so before I dive into this video, I did kind of want to offer a precursor of the fact that this is very much based on my personal experience and my personal relationship. Every relationship is different. I explained that in a video I made several months back. And this video isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to advice for this kind of life event. It's just kind of my 2 cents. So now that that's out of the way, I wanted to explain that this video is going to be broken up into 3-ish parts. The first part is going to be finances. It's not a sexy conversation. It's not a glamorous conversation, but it's, unfortunately a pretty important one. And then the second 2 parts of this video are gonna be about kind of the unexpected layers of intimacy that come with living together. Because before you move in together, you've negotiated how to share time with each other. You've negotiated how to share mental, emotional space for each other. But now you're literally combining your lives, and that just inevitably introduces kind of new perks, but also new challenges. All right, the money talk. It would be very surprising if you successfully avoided this conversation before moving in with your partner, because the very obvious question that comes up before moving in together is how to split rent. I will tell you that the money conversation will continue to come up anyway, because money is just a really integral piece of your life, and it's something that you two will inevitably have to come to an agreement on. So I think the most important thing to know when going into this conversation is that there's not one objectively correct way to approach handling one's money. And you might think, no, but savings are good and da 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 da. And it's maybe that's good for you, and maybe that's sound financial advice, but that doesn't mean that your partner is obligated to have those beliefs and values about their money. And that's why the money conversation is really important. I do want to kind of preface this with Max and I didn't have one conversation before moving in together to kind of ensure that we were aligned on this. It wasn't quite that formal, but we'd already known each other for 3 years at that point. And when you're together for a long enough amount of time, you just have conversations about money inevitably, and you kind of come to understand how the other person thinks about money. But in general, if I were to try to offer advice about how to actually have the conversation, it is very important to not enter into the conversation thinking that your way of doing money or your ideal way of doing money is objectively correct and they just need to conform to that, because that will inevitably lead to disagreement and probably some pissed off feelings. But I also think on your part, I think the best you can do is to just really kind of take an internal assessment of what your priority beliefs and values are about money, and come to the conversation with a set of opinions about how you think it should be handled, but most importantly priorities about those opinions. What are your non-negotiables? Because those are going to be the most important thing to maintain, I think, in order to be comfortable in a relationship. And I think your partner should also come to the conversation with their non-negotiable priorities as well. So ideally, you're coming on the other end of it with some sort of agreement in which both of your priorities are honored, right? That's the ideal outcome. There's not some objectively right way to handle this. There's just the need to ensure that both parties' beliefs and values are upheld in a way that everyone is comfortable. And I guess with that comes the kind of inevitability that this conversation is not just one and done. You don't just have a conversation where you both come to some sort of compromise and agreement about what your values are. Your values, much like you as a person, are going to change and morph over time. The same is true for your partner. So you will likely have these conversations again and again. Hopefully, the more you have these conversations, priorities and values about money and how to spend it, hopefully they become closer. But just, I guess, kind of know that it's not the kind of thing that you can hold your partner to as a rigid agreement. There needs to be space for the other person to kind of change and morph and grow. And part of the challenge of a relationship relationship is continuing to kind of like meet another person where they're at while both of you are inevitably changing, growing up, morphing, whatever. And that's kind of what makes the money conversation like a really good microcosmic example of just kind of like what a relationship is more generally. Obviously, finances can be really weird because people can be really weird about finances. So like it is an exception in that case, but in terms of like the need to kind of honor one another's priorities and values, even if you don't fully see eye to eye, that's kind of like what a relationship is, right? So kind of in that way, like I think moving in together does just kind of kick your relationship up to the next level, and that like those questions, those compromises, and those conversations become much realer than they had to be before. Probably something that you can kind of like skate by without really paying attention to before. It's like in your face at this point. So I think, I don't know, I think in a lot of ways it's like welcome to full force partnership, baby. Like you're sharing a life, you're not just moving in together. Okay, now for part 2. This is like the intimacy of moving in together, or like the new level of intimacy that is moving together. So to put it simply, when you move in with a partner, you have less privacy than you've probably had in a really long time. And I know what you're thinking, like, oh no, but I have roommates. But when you have roommates, you most likely, I guess, except with the exception of like college or when you were like a kid and shared a room with kids, you most likely didn't share a room with your roommate. So assuming you were going from a situation where you had your own room to now sharing a room with your partner, I don't know, I guess it's just kind of like fun to think about the fact that like there's just a level of kind of privacy and solitude in your own space that you won't have access to in the same way anymore, right? Like you can't just like go to your room and have this like unspoken agreement with your roommate that like they won't enter unless like you give them permission, you feel comfortable, whatever else. When your roommate is literally sharing the room with you, it's not necessarily fair to kind of like mark the space as your own without coming to an agreement with them about that first. So I think in that way, just like mentally, emotionally, you are offering up this person that you are in a partnership with way more space than you did before, because you are literally sharing everything and you don't have access to the same level of like autonomy and independence that you necessarily did before. And I know that sounds daunting, and I will explain at the end of this why that's actually really beautiful. But when I was talking to Max about this, I think he put it in like a really concise and like simple way. When you move in together, you are giving up a level of independence kind of in exchange for this like constant togetherness. And there are so many reasons why that's like a beautiful thing. But I think one of the things that you are losing, the inevitable opportunity cost, is this kind of access to solitude and like selfishness that you had before, right? I mean, in being in a relationship, it does kind of demand a somewhat constant consideration of your partner, but when you live with them, it's that just like gets kicked up to a new level, right? Because not only are you having to consider them in the quality time that you spend together, or I don't know, if they've like had a hard day, just like being a good partner, being there for them, you're also having to consider them when you decide not to put your clothes away, right? Because like when I leave my clothing on the floor, I am not the only one who suffers as a result of that. Max also suffers. So there's just kind of this like new layer of, oh, like I can't just treat my room like it's a sty because I'm overwhelmed, because there's another person that I need to like actively accommodate because he shares the space with me. That's the more like tangible way, but then like an emotional, mental way, it comes with expectations to kind of check in with each other and to like be accountable to one another. So if Max is staying out late or just deciding to get some drinks after work with friends or with coworkers, like he'll text me because there's just kind of this like silent expectation that he'll be home at a certain point. And if he's not, you know, I might wonder if he's dead, or I'll just be sad that I wasn't invited to the happy hour. So it does end up being another space where like you two are probably going to have to come to some sort of compromise about how to regard one another in your kind of shared home, your shared space. Every couple is going to have to come to some sort of compromise, and that's just like not something that was necessarily required before, at least for Max and I, before we moved in together. Okay, so the reason why this is really nice is because, you know, the fact that you are constantly kind of accountable and considerate of your partner means like ideally they are doing the same for you, right? And there's something really beautiful about the kind of new level of support that comes with a romantic relationship in which you now live together and like share your life together. There is just someone who has, in a sense, kind of made this agreement with you to be accountable for your feelings, happiness, experience, etc., by moving in with you. And there's just like a level of support and stability that I was almost like very pleasantly surprised by, you know, because they always tell you like, oh, like your problems won't disappear because you like take the next step in your relationship. And I guess that's true, like technically, but there was just definitely like a level of stability and security that came with Max and I moving in together. Okay, so this third point is in some ways like a continuation of the second point, right? That it's the intimacy of like combining your life with someone. And in that one, we were talking about kind of like the emotional intimacy, the emotional like kind of consideration and I guess expectations that come with it. But then there's also kind of like the simple fact of sharing all of your shit with someone, sharing chores, sharing furniture items, all the things. I think the trickiest one for me personally to navigate, and this might be true for most people, I imagine it's true for most people, but is the sharing of chores and figuring out how to kind of distribute the domestic load. Like that is something that is just kind of loaded with all sorts of, I don't know, politics, expectations. Like this is another area where the beliefs and values of your partner become something that is impossible to ignore. And the same for you, where it's like you're gonna have your own idea about how work should be distributed, or you're gonna have like a sense of, at the very least, unfairness versus fairness. And your partner is gonna have their own sense of unfairness versus fairness. And that's just kind of a tricky thing to navigate more generally. And now you're doing that, but you're doing that literally all of the time because you are constantly partaking in chores and domestic labor together. So, right? You're like living together. So, you know, if the dishes need to be done every night, like who's doing them? Are you both doing them? If dinner needs to be cooked every night, who's doing it? Are you both? Who is comfortable doing what? I think it's helpful to get real with yourself about what you think is fair going into it, but also kind of recognize that like this is going to morph and change. Like Max and I have come to like a pretty comfortable stasis at this point, but we don't have kids yet. So I think there's gonna be like a whole new set of agreements, compromises we are going to inevitably deal with once we actually have kids. Like we can talk about it, but until we have the lived experience, it's a little bit hard to prepare for. And I guess in terms of advice, I think the best way to approach this, if you are trying to go into it, maybe like level-headed and like with an action plan, is I would go personal. I would kind of similar to the finances, like go personal, like what are your like rigid beliefs here? What are your priorities? What do you truly think is fair? What do you truly think is unfair? So when I was like writing this all out, I was almost like learning because I was reflecting and analyzing, and something I'd kind of realized that I think something that would be really helpful for this conversation, or kind of even establishing a set of like beliefs and like non-negotiables for this sort of thing, is to kind of like try to sit down and really take stock of how you contribute to like the domestic load. And I think particularly for, well, no, I think this is true on both sides, but I think particularly for women, recognize that there are some things that you are literally like socialized to do that you will just very naturally kind of fall into the pattern or the habit of doing, that is like domestic workload and probably takes time away from your ability to focus on hobbies, your career, etc., etc. Just try to take stock of that and like get really serious about evaluating it fairly. Right? So an example of this would be, I was pretty much the leader in like decorating our apartment. And I think from the outside, like decorating the apartment sounds like a lot of fun and it's just like a hobby and it's very sweet. But in truth, there are a lot of unsexy steps that come with designing and like executing a space, right? Like when you're furniture shopping, you need to measure to make sure it fits correctly. You need to make sure that it is kind of optimal in terms of functionality if you're in a space like a New York City apartment where you're pretty limited on space. So you need to make sure that you're kind of taking the most advantage of the space that you can by buying a piece of furniture that ideally lasts for like as long as you need it to last and offers a level of functionality that's probably higher than it would need to be in like a suburban home where you have a little bit more sprawl space. Like I remember doing a ton of research for like the couch, a ton of research for like the Medea unit, and like that stuff was not that sexy. From the outside it's shopping, but from the inside it's going through reviews and like taking measurements and like trying to figure out like which one is the best based on like the videos or whatever else. And so there's a lot of kind of hard work that goes into it, and it took me a little bit to kind of really give myself credit for the level of work and output that required. And I know for Max, like one of the things that comes really naturally to him is dishes. I don't think he ever had the issue of attributing value to the task of doing dishes in the same way that I did with shopping, because that's kind of like a gender norms thing, right? But when we were talking about this, we were kind of talking about how the things that you do naturally do, just because you fall into the habit doesn't mean that like you're good, right? So it's like, I'm like, well, I'm decorating the space, so and I spent like X number of hours on that, so like you have to make up for all the whatever. No, if the thing can wait, or if like there should be other priorities in a given week, like if I'm spending all of my chore time on like decorating the space, that's not very fair to Max. If he is like at capacity. So I guess there are kind of two parts to this. I would definitely advise that anyone who goes into it, try to recognize the value in the work that they do that they don't typically attribute value to, recognize the things that they gravitate towards naturally, and kind of recognize when you are defaulting too readily to the things that you naturally gravitate towards, and kind of putting extra unagreed upon work on your partner. And obviously, I'm like, of all topics, this one might be the least sexy because chores suck. But something that's really nice about this kind of level of intimacy, of this like level of accountability to each other, is that because that person is like more accountable to you than like the average roommate would be, it means that you have like an extra kind of backstop of support at times in your life when like you don't have capacity, because maybe like your work life is super busy, or like something in your social life is going on, like a friend's visiting from out of town. The really lovely thing about kind of living with a partner and sharing a life with a partner and being emotionally accountable for one another is that you kind of recognize when your partner is in need of help and is at capacity in their own life, and it's kind of on you to fill in the gaps for them. And you know, ideally when they recognize that in you, when you are at capacity, they will also kind of return it in kind. So the chores, you're probably gonna get into little disagreements about who should be doing what, or if anyone's doing enough, whatever, more opportunities to bicker, yada yada yada. But the reason I wanted to kind of name both of these steps levels of intimacy is because like that's what it is. And there's just a level of emotional accountability and togetherness that will result from combining your life with this person that, you know, should end up being like a really wonderful experience, even if you're missing out on some of the things you had access to more readily before, and even if it means that like you have more opportunities to argue or bicker with your partner than before. I think it's like a fun step, and it's a wonderful time in life. And that's probably why most people don't make videos about it, because hopefully if you're moving in together, you're ready. It's not like you need like a bulletproof vest to do it. At the end of the day, I guess the best advice I could give you is to just try to have fun with it, because I don't know, you're about to move in with probably your best friend, and you're pretty much constantly doing sleepovers with your best friend from here on out if things go right. And just kind of know that the pressure that comes with it is inevitable, and everyone goes through it. Don't overthink it. Anyway, this is the second video. I think it's the second video I've tried to offer relationship advice in. On my channel, I try to do videos kind of like this, but more so just like meditating on life in your 20s. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you so much for watching. This was a fun one. And if you live with your partner and you have any tips that you think should be covered, please drop them in the comments. I would love to hear from you. That's it for this one. I will catch you in the next one. Bye. The people need proof.
I know. No, I'm anxious. Like, am I cleaning right?
You're killing it. No notes.